Hello, everyone. My name is Rebecca Zitlow, and I'm the Dean of the College of Law. And I'm here to welcome you all to the Stranahan National Issues Forum lecture by Professor Alan Rosenstein from the University of Minnesota Law School. I'm going to start by introducing our own beloved Professor Greg Gilchrist, but I promised it would be in only one sentence. So he teaches and writes in the areas of criminal law, corporate law, criminal procedure, and white-collar crime, and he is a beloved professor, scholar, a wonderful scholar, and a beloved colleague.
Too long a sentence.
That was one run-on sentence.
Thank you, everyone, and welcome to the Stranahan National Issues Forum. This forum happens once or twice a year, ideally, and it aims to bring speakers to the College of Law to address issues of national importance. We have this forum thanks to the generosity of the Stranahan family that makes this possible, but also thanks to the stewardship and sponsorship of the College of Law, as well this year as the Institute on American Constitutional Thought and Leadership. I really enjoy this event. I've always loved this event, whether I was involved directly with it or not. I've seen so many great things. We've heard compelling presentations in the past from great lawyers, from learned judges, from esteemed professors, and indeed from at least one convicted felon. It's been a terrific event. I told our speaker that I'd say he's a guy from Minnesota and get off the stage, and actually I'd really like to do that because what he has to say is much more interesting than anything I can say. But you do need to know who you're hearing from. And so I'll just say very briefly, Alan Rosenstein is a proud graduate of the Long Island, New York public school system, also a graduate of Harvard College and Harvard Law School. He is now a professor of law at the University of Minnesota. He has served previously in a national security role at the Department of Justice. Presently, he is also a fellow at the Brookings Institution and a research director at the Lawfare Institute. I think it's fair to say that he is a leading thinker nationally on questions of national and cybersecurity, on technology and the law and constitutional law matters. Today, he's going to talk to us about a particular technological advance that's on all of our minds, AI, and how, or maybe more, the challenges that it may pose to our constitutional order. So with that, let's welcome Professor Rosenstein. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I just want to make sure if this is on. Excellent. First, I'd like to thank Toledo Law School, Dean Zitlow, and Professor Gilchrist for inviting me, and so much to the Stranahan National Issues Forum for the opportunity to speak with you all today. It is a real honor to be part of this series. In 1973, the historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr., who had served as a senior advisor in the Kennedy White House, gave us his famous book, The Imperial Presidency, documenting the systematic expansion of unilateral presidential power that began with Washington and that Schlesinger was chronicling in the shadow of Nixon and Watergate. Now, each administration since then, Democratic and Republican alike, has argued for expansive executive authorities. Ford, Carter, Reagan, Bush 1, Clinton, Bush 2, Obama, the first Trump administration, the Biden administration, and what we're watching right now in the second Trump administration is nothing short of breathtaking. Now, this pattern of ever-expanding executive power has always been driven, at least partly, by technology. Indeed, through human history, transformative technologies drove large-scale state evolution. Agriculture made populations large enough for taxation and conscription. Writing enabled bureaucratic empires across time and distance. The telegraph and the railroad annihilated space, centralizing control over vast territories. And computing made the modern administrative state logistically possible. For American presidents specifically, this technological progression has been decisive. Lincoln was the first wired president, using the telegraph to centralize military command during the Civil War. FDR, JFK, and Reagan all used radio and then television to go public and speak directly to the masses. And Trump, of course, is the undisputed master of social media. What I've come here to tell you today is this: we haven't seen anything yet. Previous expansions of presidential power were still constrained by human limitations, but artificial intelligence eliminates those constraints, producing not incremental growth, but a structural transformation of the presidency. And in this lecture, I want to examine 5 mechanisms through which AI will concentrate unprecedented authority in the White House, turning Schlesinger's imperial presidency into what I call the unitary artificial executive. The first mechanism is the expansion of emergency powers. AI crises, things like autonomous weapons attacks or AI-enabled cybersecurity breaches, justify broad presidential action, exploiting the same judicial deference to executive authority in emergencies that courts have shown from the Civil War through 9/11 and down to the present. Second, AI enables perfect enforcement through automated surveillance and enforcement mechanisms, eliminating the need for the prosecutorial discretion that has always limited executive power. The third mechanism is information dominance. AI-powered messaging can saturate the public sphere through automated propaganda and micro-targeted persuasion, overwhelming the marketplace of ideas. Fourth, AI national security creates what scholars call the double black box, inscrutable AI nested inside national security secrecy. And when these inscrutable systems operate at machine speed, oversight becomes impossible. Cyber operations and autonomous weapons engagements complete in milliseconds, far too fast and too opaque for meaningful oversight. And fifth, and most dramatically, AI can finally realize the vision of the unitary executive. By that, I mean something specific, not just a presidency with broad substantive authorities, but one that exerts complete centralized control over executive branch decision-making. AI can serve as a cognitive proxy throughout the executive branch, injecting presidential preferences directly into algorithmic decisions, making unitary control technologically feasible for the very first time. Now, these mechanisms operate in 2 different ways. The first 4 expand the practical scope of presidential authority: emergency powers, enforcement, information control, and national security operations. They expand what presidents can do. The 5th mechanism is different. It is about control. It determines how these powers are exercised. And the combination of these 2 creates an unprecedented concentration of power. Now, my argument is forward-looking, but it's not speculative. From a legal perspective, these mechanisms build on existing presidential powers, and they fit very comfortably within current constitutional doctrine. From a technological perspective, none of this requires artificial superintelligence or artificial general intelligence. All of these capabilities are doable with today's tools, and certainly achievable within the next few years. Now, before we go further, let me tell you where I'm coming from. My academic career has focused on 2 research areas. First, the regulation of emerging technology, and second, executive power. Up until now, these have been largely separate. This lecture brings these 2 tracks together. But I also have some practical experience that's relevant to this project. As Professor Gilchrist noted in his kind introduction, before becoming a law professor, I was a junior policy attorney in the National Security Division at the Department of Justice. In other words, I was a card-carrying member of what the current administration calls the deep state. One thing I learned is that the federal bureaucracy is very hard to govern. Decision-making is decentralized, information is siloed, civil servants have enormous autonomy, not so much because of their formal authority, but because governing millions of employees is, from a practical perspective, impossible. And that practical ungovernability, however, is about to become very governable. Now, together with Nicholas Bednar, my colleague at the University of Minnesota Law School, I've been researching how this transformation might happen and what it means for constitutional governance. This lecture is the first draft of the research that we've been conducting. So let's jump right in. To understand how the 5 mechanisms of expanded presidential power will operate and why they're not speculative, we need to start with AI's actual capabilities. What can AI actually do today, and what will it be able to do in the near future? Again, I'm not talking about artificial general intelligence or superintelligence. These remain speculative, possibly decades away. I'm talking about today's capabilities, including technology that right now is being deployed in government systems. Now, it's helpful to think of AI as a kind of pipeline with 3 stages: collection, analysis, and then execution. So the first stage is data collection at scale. The best AI-powered facial recognition, for example, achieves over 99.9% accuracy. The company Clearview AI, used by federal and state law enforcement, has over 60 billion images. The Department of Defense's Project Maven, an AI-powered video analysis program, demonstrates the impact of all of this. 20 people using AI can now replicate what required 2,000. That is a 100-fold increase in efficiency. The second stage of AI is data analysis. AI analyzes data at scales humans simply cannot match. FINRA, the financial industry self-regulator, currently processes 600 billion, with a B, transactions every day using algorithmic surveillance, a volume that would require an army of analysts if it would be possible at all with humans. FBI algorithms assess thousands of tip line calls every day for threat levels and credibility. Systems like those from the technology company Palantir integrate databases across dozens of agencies in real time. All of this analysis happens continuously, comprehensively, and far faster than human oversight. Finally, the third stage of AI is automated execution, operating at speeds and scales, again, outstripping human capabilities. For example, DARPA's AI-controlled F-16 fighter jet has successfully engaged human pilots in mock dogfights, demonstrating autonomous combat capabilities. The Federal Cybersecurity Agency CISA's autonomous systems block more than 1 billion suspicious network connection requests across the federal government every year. And there are dozens of more examples that I could cite. So to summarize, AI can sense everything, it can process everything, and it can act on everything, all at digital speed and scale. Now, these are just today's capabilities. They're not speculation about future AI, but they're also just the baseline of what's possible. And AI is scaling up dramatically, driven by two distinct forces. Now, the first driver is the internal trajectory of AI itself. Training compute, the processing power used to build AI systems, has increased 4 to 5 times per year since 2010. Epoch AI, a research organization tracking AI progress, projects that frontier AI models will use thousands of times more compute than was used to train OpenAI's GPT-4, and this by 2030, with training clusters costing over $100 billion. So what will this enable? By 2030 at the latest, AI should be capable of building large-scale software projects, producing advanced mathematical proofs, and engaging in multi-week autonomous research. In government, that means AI systems that don't just analyze, but execute complete large-scale tasks from start to finish. Now, the second driver of AI advancement is geopolitical competition. China's 2017 AI development plan targets global leadership by 2030, backed by massive state investment. They've deployed generative AI news anchors and built the nationwide Skynet video surveillance system. And yes, they actually called it that. China's technical capabilities are advancing rapidly. The DeepSeek breakthrough earlier this year demonstrated that Chinese researchers can match or exceed Western AI performance, often at a fraction of the cost. Now, in today's polarized Washington, there's really only one thing that Democrats and Republicans can disagree on: that China is scary and must be confronted. That consensus is driving much of AI policy. So it's unsurprising that the administration's recent AI action plan frames the US response as seeking, quote, unquestioned technological dominance. Federal generative AI use cases have increased 9-fold in just the last year alone, and the Defense Department awarded $800 million in AI contracts this past July. Perhaps more ominously, DoD has also established detailed procedures for developing autonomous lethal weapons, reflecting the Pentagon's assumptions that such systems are the future. Now, it's easy to see how this competitive dynamic could be used to justify concentrating AI in the executive branch. Well, we can't afford congressional delay. Transparency would give adversaries advantages. Traditional deliberation is incompatible with the speed of AI deployment. The AI arms race could easily become a permanent emergency, justifying rapid deployment. Okay, so those are the drivers of AI progress: rapidly advancing capabilities and geopolitical pressures. Now let's examine the 5 distinct mechanisms through which these forces will actually concentrate presidential power. And let me start with emergency powers. Presidential emergency powers rest on 2 sources, each with deep historical roots. The first is inherent presidential authority under Article 2 of the Constitution. For example, during the Civil War, Lincoln blockaded southern ports, increased the army, and spent unauthorized funds, all claiming inherent constitutional authority as commander-in-chief. Now, the second source of emergency powers are explicit congressional delegations. When FDR, for example, closed every bank in March of 1933, he did so under the Trading with the Enemies Act. After 9/11, Congress passed an authorization for the use of military force, still in effect 2 decades later, and the source of ongoing military operations across multiple continents. Today, the presidency operates under more than 40 continuing national emergencies. For example, Trump has invoked IEEPA to impose many of his ongoing tariffs, declaring trade imbalances as a national security emergency. Importantly, with both sources, courts usually defer. From the prize cases upholding Lincoln's southern blockade, through Korematsu affirming Japanese internment, to Trump versus Hawaii permitting the first Trump administration's Muslim travel bans, the Supreme Court has generally granted presidents extraordinary latitude during emergencies. There are, of course, exceptions, Youngstown and the post-9/11 cases like Hamdi and Boumediene being the most famous, but the pattern is clear. When the president invokes national security or emergency powers, judicial review tends to be quite limited. So what has constrained emergency powers? Well, the emergencies themselves. Throughout history, emergencies were generally rare and time-limited. The Civil War, the Great Depression, Pearl Harbor, wars ended and crises receded. Our separation of powers framework has generally worked because it assumes that emergencies have generally been the temporary exception and not the norm. But AI breaks this assumption. AI empowers adversaries asymmetrically, giving offensive capabilities that outpace defensive responses. Foreign actors can use AI to identify vulnerabilities, automate attacks, and target critical infrastructure at previously impossible scale and speed. The same AI capabilities that strengthen the president also strengthen our adversaries, creating a perpetual heightened threat that justifies permanent emergency powers. So here's what an AI-enabled emergency might look like. A foreign adversary uses AI to target US critical infrastructure, things like the power grid or the financial system or water treatment. Within hours, the president invokes IEPA, the Defense Production Act, and his inherent Article 2 authority. AI surveillance monitors all network traffic. Algorithmic screening begins for financial transactions, and compliance monitoring extends across critical infrastructure. Now, the immediate crisis might pass in 48 hours, but the emergency infrastructure never gets dismantled. Surveillance remains operational, and each emergency builds infrastructure for the next one. So why does our constitutional system permit this? Well, first, speed. Presidential action completes before Congress can react. And second, secrecy. Classification shields details from Congress, courts, and the public. And third, judicial deference. Courts defer almost automatically when the phrases national security and emergency appear in the same sentence, invoked together. And to add insult to injury, the president's own AI systems might soon be the ones assessing threats and determining what even counts as an emergency. Now, emergency powers are, theoretically at least, episodic. But enforcement of the laws happens continuously, every day, in every interaction between citizens and the state. And that's where the second mechanism, perfect enforcement, operates. Pre-AI governance depends on enforcement discretion. We have thousands of criminal statutes and millions of regulations, and so inevitably, prosecutors have to choose cases. Agencies have to prioritize violations, and police have to exercise judgment. The Supreme Court has recognized this necessity. In cases like Heckler versus Cheney, Batchelder, and Waite, the court held that non-enforcement decisions are presumptively unreviewable because agencies must allocate scarce resources. Now, this discretion prevents tyranny by allowing mercy, context, and human judgment. But AI eliminates that necessity. When every violation can be detected and every rule can be enforced, enforcement discretion becomes a choice rather than a practical constraint. The question becomes, what happens when the Take Care Clause meets perfect enforcement? Does the Take Care Clause allow the president to enforce the laws to the hilt? Might it even require him to do so? As an example, consider what perfect enforcement in the immigration context might look like. And you can also imagine this across other domains: tax compliance, environmental violations, workplace safety, even traffic laws. Already, facial recognition databases cover tens of millions of Americans. Real-time camera networks monitor movement, financial systems track transactions, social media analysis identifies patterns, and automated risk assessment scores individuals. Again, China is leading the way. Its social credit system demonstrates what's possible when these technologies are all integrated. Now imagine the president directs DHS to do the same. Build a single AI system that identifies every visa overstay and automatically generates enforcement actions. There are no more enforcement priorities. The algorithm just flags everyone, and ICE officers blindly execute its millions of directives with perfect consistency. Again, we might ask, how does the Constitution permit this? Well, the Take Care Clause traditionally required discretion, again, because resource limits made total enforcement impossible. But AI changes this. Now the Take Care Clause can be read as consistent with eliminating discretion. The president isn't violating his duty by enforcing everything. He's just being thorough. More aggressively, the president might even argue that perfect enforcement is not just permitted, but is required. After all, Congress wrote these laws, and the president is merely faithfully executing what Congress commanded, now that technology finally makes it possible. If there's no resource constraint, then there's no justification for discretion. Well, what about individual rights like equal protection or due process? In fact, the Constitution might actually favor algorithmic enforcement. Equal protection might be satisfied by perfect consistency if the algorithmic enforcement treats identical violations identically, eliminating the arbitrary disparities that plague human judgment. And due process might be satisfied if AI proves more accurate than humans, which it well may be. Power once dispersed among millions of fallible officials becomes concentrated in algorithmic policy that could, compared to the human alternative, be more consistent, more accurate, and even more just. There's one final effect that perfect enforcement produces. It ratchets up punishment beyond congressional intent. Congress writes laws assuming enforcement discretion will moderate impact. They set harsh penalties knowing prosecutors will focus on serious cases, and agencies will prioritize egregious violations while minor infractions will largely be ignored. But AI removes that backdrop. When every violation is enforced, even trivial ones that Congress never really expected would be prosecuted, the net effect is dramatically higher punitiveness. Congress calibrated the system assuming discretion would filter out the minor cases, but AI enforces everything, producing, on aggregate, a severity that Congress never intended. Now, the first two mechanisms concentrating presidential power, emergency powers and perfect enforcement, expand what the president can do. The third mechanism is about controlling what citizens know. AI enables the president to saturate public discourse at unprecedented scales. And if the executive controls what citizens see, hear, and believe, how can Congress, courts, or the public effectively resist? The Supreme Court has held that the First Amendment does not restrict the government's own speech. The government speech doctrine means that the government can select monuments, it can choose license plate messages, communicate preferred policies, all with no constitutional limit on volume, persistence, or sophistication. Until now, practical constraints limited the scale of this speech. More messages required more people, more time, and more resources. But AI eliminates these constraints, enabling content generation at near zero marginal cost, operating across all platforms simultaneously and delivering personalized messages to every citizen. The government speech doctrine never contemplated AI-powered saturation, and there is unfortunately no limiting principle in existing case law. Again, we can look to China for the future. It is already using AI to saturate public discourse. In August, leaked documents revealed that Golaxy, a Chinese AI company, built a, quote, smart propaganda system, an AI that monitors millions of posts daily and generates personalized counter-messaging in real time, producing content that, according to the company, feels authentic and avoids detection. The Chinese government has reportedly used this system to suppress Hong Kong protest movements and influence Taiwanese elections. Now imagine an American president deploying these capabilities domestically. It's 2027. A major presidential scandal breaks. Congress investigates, courts rule executive actions unconstitutional, and in response, the presidential AI response system activates. It floods social media platforms, news aggregators, and recommendation algorithms with government-generated content. Now let's say you're a suburban Lucas County parent worried about safety, and your phone shows AI-generated content about how the congressional investigation threatens law enforcement funding, accompanied by some fake local crime statistics. Now your neighbor, a student at the excellent local law school, is concerned about civil liberties. She sees completely different content about partisan witch hunts, undermining due process. Same scandal, but different narratives. The public can't even agree on basic facts. The AI system operates in three layers. First, it generates personalized messaging, detecting which demographics are persuadable and which narratives are gaining traction. It then conducts A/B testing and adjusts counter-messaging in real time. Second, it manipulates platform algorithms, persuading social media companies to downrank disinformation, which means congressional hearings never surface in your feed and news about court decisions get buried. And third, it saturates public discourse just through sheer volume, generating millions of messages across all platforms that drown out opposition, not through censorship, but through a scale that private speakers can't match. And all the while, the First Amendment offers no constraint because the government speech doctrine allows the government to say whatever it wants, as much as it wants, and whenever it wants. Information dominance makes resistance to the other mechanisms impossible. How do you organize opposition to emergency powers if you never hear about them? How do you resist perfect enforcement if you've been convinced that it's necessary? And how do you check national security decisions if you're convinced of the threat and if you can't even understand how the AI made the decisions in the first place? And this brings us to our fourth mechanism. National security is where presidential power reaches its apex. The Constitution grants the president enormous authority as commander-in-chief, with control over intelligence and classification, and courts have historically granted extreme judicial deference. Courts defer to military decisions, and the political question doctrine bars review of many national security judgments. Now, of course, Congress retains constitutional checks, the power to declare war, appropriate funds, demand intelligence briefings, and conduct investigations. But AI creates what the University of Virginia law professor Ashley Deeks calls the double black box, a problem that renders these checks largely ineffective. Now, the first of these boxes, the inner one, is AI's opacity. AI systems are inscrutable black boxes themselves that even their designers can't fully explain. Congressional staffers lack technical expertise to evaluate them, and courts have no framework for passing judgment on algorithmic military decisions. No one, not even the executive branch officials nominally in charge, can explain why this AI reached a particular decision in this instance. The second, outer box, is traditional national security secrecy. Classification shields operational details, and the state secret privilege blocks judicial review. The executive controls intelligence access, meaning that Congress depends on the executive for the very information needed for oversight. Now, these layers combine. Congress can't oversee what it can't see or understand. Courts can't review what they can't access or evaluate. The public can't hold anyone accountable for what's invisible and incomprehensible. And then speed makes it all much, much worse. AI operations complete in minutes, if not seconds, creating fait accompli before oversight can engage. By the time Congress learns what happened through classified briefings, facts on the grounds have changed. Even if Congress could overcome both layers of inscrutability, it would be too late to restrain executive action. Consider what this would look like in practice. It's 3:47 a.m., and a foreign military AI probes U.S. critical infrastructure. This time, it's the industrial control systems that control the eastern seaboard's electrical grid. 30 milliseconds later, the U.S. Cyber Command's AI detects the intrusion and assesses a 99.7% probability that this is reconnaissance for a future attack. Less than a second later, the AI decision tree executes. It evaluates its options. Monitoring is insufficient, counter-probing would be inadequate, blocking would only be temporary, and selects a counterattack targeting foreign military command and control. The system accesses authorization from pre-delegated protocols and deploys the appropriate malware. 3 minutes after the initial probe, the US AI has disrupted the foreign military networks. It's taken their air defenses offline, compromised their communications, and destabilized their own power grids. At 3:51 a.m., a Cyber Command officer is notified of the completed operation. At 7:30, the president receives a briefing over breakfast of a serious military operation that she, supposedly the commander-in-chief, had no role in. But she's actually still better off than congressional leadership, which only learns about the operation later that day when CNN breaks the story. This won't be an isolated incident. Each AI operation completes before oversight is possible, establishing precedent for the next. By the time Congress or courts have responded, strategic facts have changed. The constitutional separation of powers requires transparency and time, both of which AI operations eliminate. Now, the first four mechanisms, emergency powers, perfect enforcement, information dominance, and inscrutable national security decisions, expand the scope of presidential power. Each extends presidential reach. But the fifth mechanism is different. It's not about doing more, but about controlling how it gets done. After all, how is a single president supposed to control a bureaucracy of nearly 3 million civil employees making untold decisions every day? The unitary executive theory has been debated for over 2 centuries and has recently become the dominant constitutional position at the US Supreme Court. But in all this time, it's always been, practically speaking, impossible. But AI removes those practical constraints. Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution states that the executive power shall be vested in a president. The executive power, a president, singular. This is the textual foundation for the unitary executive theory. The idea that all executive authority flows through one person and that this one person must therefore control all executive authority. The main battleground for this theory has been unilateral presidential firing authority. If the president can fire subordinates at will, control follows. The first Congress debated this in 1789 when James Madison proposed that department secretaries be removable by the president alone. Congress's decision at the time implied that the president had such a power, but we've been fighting about it ever since. The Supreme Court has zigzagged on this issue, from Myers in 1926 affirming broad presidential removal powers to Humphrey's executor less than a decade later, carving out huge exceptions for independent agencies, to Morrison versus Olson in 1988, where Justice Scalia's lone dissent defended the unitary executive. But by Saylor Law versus CFPB in 2020, Scalia's dissent had become the majority view. Unitary executive theory is now ascendant. And we'll see how far the court pushes it further when it decides on Federal Reserve Board independence later this term. But again, in a practical sense, the constitutional questions have always been somewhat second order. Even if the president had constitutional authority for unitary control, the practical reality made it impossible. Harry Truman famously quipped about Eisenhower upon his election in 1952. He'll sit there in the Oval Office and he'll say, do this, do that, and nothing will happen. Poor Ike. It won't be a bit like the Army. He'll find it all very frustrating. One person just can't process information from millions of employees, supervise 400 agencies, and know what subordinates are doing across the vast federal bureaucracy. Career civil servants can slow-roll directives, misinterpret guidance, quietly resist, or simply just not know what their president wants them to do. The real constraint on presidential power has always been practical, not constitutional. But AI removes these constraints. It transforms the unitary executive theory from a constitutional dream into an operational reality. Now here's a concrete example, and this one is real, not hypothetical. In January, the Trump administration sent a, quote, fork in the road email to federal employees. Return to office, accept downsizing, pledge loyalty, or take deferred resignation. DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, used Meta's Llama 2 AI model to review and classify responses. In a subsequent email, DOGE asked employees to describe 5 weekly accomplishments and used AI to assess whether their work was mission critical. If AI can determine mission criticality, it can assess tone, sentiment, loyalty, or dissent. Now, DOGE analyzed responses to one email, but the same technology works for all emails, every text message, every memo, and every Slack conversation. Federal email systems are centrally managed. Workplace platforms are deployed government-wide, and because there are AI systems like Llama that are open source, the creators, like Meta, can't refuse to have their systems used for this kind of internal executive branch monitoring. And because federal employees have limited privacy expectations in their work communications, the Fourth Amendment permits most government surveillance on the job. Now, monitoring is just the beginning. The real transformation comes from training AI on presidential preferences. The training data is everywhere. Campaign speeches, policy statements, social media, executive orders, signing statements, tweets, all continuously updated. The result is an algorithmic representation of the president's priorities. Call it Trump GPT. Now deploy that model throughout the executive branch, and you can route every memo through the AI for alignment checks, screen every agenda for presidential priorities, and evaluate every recommendation against the president's predicted preferences. The president's desires become embedded in the workflow itself. But it goes even further. AI can generate presidential opinions on issues the president never even considered. Traditionally, even the wonkiest of presidents have only had enough cognitive bandwidth for, 20, maybe 30 marquee issues: immigration, defense, the economy. Everything else gets delegated to bureaucratic middle management. But AI changes this as well. The president can now have a, quote, opinion on everything. EPA rule on wetlands permits? Well, cross-reference it with energy policy. USDA guidance on organic labeling? The AI can check that against the agriculture priorities. FCC decision on rural broadband? Align it with the president's public statements on infrastructure. Now, the president need not have personally considered these issues. It's enough that the AI learned the president's preferences and applied them. And if you're worried about preference drift, just keep the model accurate through a feedback loop, periodically sampling a few decisions and validating them with the president. And here's why this matters. Once the president achieves AI-enabled control over the executive branch, all the other mechanisms become far more powerful. When emergency powers are invoked, the president can now deploy that authority systematically across every agency simultaneously through AI systems. Perfect enforcement becomes truly universal when the presidential priorities are embedded algorithmically through government. Information dominates operates at massive scale when all executive branch communications are coordinated through shared AI frameworks. And inscrutable national security decisions multiply when every agency can act at machine speed under algorithmic control. Each mechanism ends up reinforcing the other. Now, this might all sound like a dystopian science fiction scenario, but here's what's particularly disturbing. This AI-enabled control actually fulfills the Supreme Court's vision of the unitary executive theory. It's the natural synthesis of a 21st century technology meeting this court's interpretation of an 18th century document. Let me show you what I mean by taking the court's own reasoning seriously. In Free Enterprise Fund versus PCAOB in 2010, the court wrote the following: "The Constitution requires that a president chosen by the entire nation oversee the execution of the laws." And in Saylor Law, a decade later, only the president, along with the vice president, is elected by the entire nation. So the argument goes something like this: the president has unique democratic legitimacy as the only official elected by all the voters. Therefore, the president should control the executive branch. Now, this is not actually a good argument, but let's just accept the court's logic for a moment. If the president is the uniquely democratic voice that therefore should oversee execution of all the laws, then what's wrong with an AI system that replicates presidential preferences across millions of decisions? Isn't that the apogee of democratic accountability? After all, every bureaucratic decision is now aligned with the preferences of the only official chosen by the entire nation. This is the unitary executive theory taken to its absurd, yet I think quite logical conclusion. Let's review. We've examined 5 mechanisms concentrating presidential power: emergency powers creating permanent crisis, perfect enforcement eliminating discretion, information dominance saturating discourse, the national security black box that's too opaque and too fast for oversight, and an AI that makes the unitary executive technologically feasible. Together, they create an executive too fast, too complex, too comprehensive, and too powerful to constrain. So what do we do? Are there legal or institutional responses that could restrain the unitary artificial executive before it fully materializes? Look, my job as an academic is to spot problems. I tend not to fix them. But it seems impolite to leave you all with a sense of impending doom. So, acknowledging that I am more confident in the diagnosis than in the prescription, let me offer some potential responses. But before I do, let me also make this clear. Although I've spent the last 33 minutes or so on some serious doom and gloom, I'm actually the farthest thing from an AI skeptic. AI can massively improve government operations through faster service, better compliance, and reduced bias. At a time when Americans believe that government is dysfunctional, because it often is, AI offers real solutions. The question is not whether to use AI in the government. We should and we will. The question is how to capture these benefits while preventing the unchecked concentration of power. So let's start with some legislative solutions. Congress could, for example, require congressional authorization before the executive branch deploys high-capability AI systems. It could limit emergency declarations to 30 or 60 days without congressional renewal. And it could require explainable decisions with a human in the loop for critical determinations. But the challenges to this are pretty obvious. Any president can just veto restrictions on their own power. And in our polarized age, it's very hard to imagine a veto-proof majority on anything. The president also controls how the laws are executed, so statutory requirements could be interpreted narrowly or just ignored. Classification could shield AI systems from oversight, and human-in-the-loop requirements could become just a rubber stamp. So beyond statutory text, we also need to think about institutional reforms. Start with oversight. Create, let's say, an independent inspector general for AI with technical experts and clearance to access classified systems. But since oversight only works if overseers understand the technology, we also need to build congressional technical capacity by restoring the Office of Technology Assessment and expanding the Congressional Research Service's AI expertise. And courts need similar resources, technical education programs, and access to court-appointed AI experts. We could also work through the private sector, imposing explainability and auditing requirements on the companies doing AI business with the federal government. And most ambitiously, we could try to embed legal compliance directly into the AI architecture itself, designing law-following AI systems with constitutional constraints built directly into the models. Again, though, each of these proposals faces obstacles. Inspectors general risk capture by the agencies they oversee. Technical expertise doesn't guarantee political will. Congress and courts could understand AI but still defer to the executive. National security classification could exempt government AI systems from explainability and auditing requirements. And as for law-following AI, we don't actually know how to do that yet. We still need to figure out how to train a model to teach it what following the law actually means in practice. So maybe the problem is more fundamental. maybe what we need to do is rethink our constitutional framework itself for executive power. Now, let's not talk about constitutional amendments here. They are unrealistic. The last was 1992, and partisan polarization makes the Article 5 process nearly impossible. So more promising would be judicial reinterpretation of existing constitutional provisions. Courts could hold that Article 2's vesting and take care clauses don't prohibit congressional regulation of executive branch AI. Courts could also use the non-delegation doctrine to require that Congress set clear standards for AI deployment rather than cutting the executive a blank check. And due process could require algorithmic transparency and meaningful human oversight as constitutional minimums, at least in certain high-stakes decisions. But I think the deeper problem is the unitary executive theory itself. And this is why I titled this lecture The Unitary Artificial Executive, as a warning that this constitutional theory becomes even more dangerous once AI makes it technologically feasible. So here is my provocation to my colleagues in the academy and the courts who advocate for a unitary executive theory. Your theory, combined with AI, leads to consequences you never anticipated and probably don't actually want. The unitary executive theory values efficiency, decisiveness, unity of command. It treats bureaucratic friction as dysfunction. But what if that friction is actually a feature, not a bug? What if bureaucratic slack, professional independence, expert dissent, the messy pluralism of the administrative state are what stand between us and tyranny? The ultimate constitutional solution may require reconsidering the unitary executive theory itself. Perfect presidential control is not a constitutional requirement. Rather, it is a recipe for autocracy once technology makes it achievable. We need to preserve spaces where the executive does not speak with one mind, whether that mind is human or machine. So I just offered a couple of statutory approaches, institutional reforms, and constitutional reinterpretations. But again, let's be honest about the obstacles. AI develops faster often than law can regulate it. Most legislators and judges don't understand AI well enough to constrain it. And both parties want presidential control when they and both parties want presidential power when they control the White House. But lawyers have confronted existential rule of law challenges before. After Watergate, the Church Committee reforms led to real constraints on executive surveillance. After 9/11, when crisis and executive power claimed unchecked detention authority, lawyers fought, forcing the Supreme Court to check executive overreach. When crisis and executive power threaten constitutional governance, lawyers have been the constraint. And if I may address the students in the audience for a moment, let me say, you will be as well part of this. You are entering the legal profession at a pivotal moment. Everyone says that, but I think this time it really is true. The next decade will determine whether constitutional government survives the age of AI. Lawyers will be on the front lines of this fight. Some will work in the executive branch as the humans in the loop. Some will work in Congress, drafting statutes and demanding explanations. Some will litigate, bringing cases, performing discovery, and forcing judicial confrontation. The unitary artificial executive is not inevitable. It is a choice we're making incrementally, often without realizing it. And so the question is, will we choose to constrain it while we still can? Or will we wake up one day to find that we've built a constitutional autocracy, not through a coup, but through some code? This is a problem that we are still learning to see, but seeing it is the first step, and you all will determine what comes next. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Come around with a microphone if you have a question, just raise your hand. Yes.
Thank you. Appreciate the lecture, Professor Rosenstein. Thank you. I learned last night that the University of Toledo Law School currently requires us to mention, students to mention when AI is used in product. And so, full disclosure, I had an AI assist with this question. In your lecture, you described how AI creates offensive capabilities that can overwhelm non-AI defenses, producing an asymmetry between actors who use AI and those who don't. Would you say that similar kind of asymmetry already exists in the legal profession, where an attorney who effectively uses AI tools in litigation could overwhelm an opponent who lacks them? Thank you.
Very interesting question. I think one important difference is that when you're litigating, there's no bad side, right? Both parties have the right and the obligation to press their case with full vigor, right? That's not true when the US is fighting Russian hackers, right? We don't have to hand it to the Russian hackers, right? Whereas I think when you have two lawyers, both operating within professional guidelines, right? The lawyer that can do a better job, can write the brief faster, write the brief better, do all the stuff because they use AI, I think that's a good thing. Now, obviously, there's this whole separate conversation that I'm sure many of you are having. We're at a law school. It's something that my faculty talks about incessantly, though we haven't figured out what to do about it, of what should the role of AI be in legal practice and legal education. We've all read the stories on Above the Law about hallucinated cases, but that'll all be fixed, right? This is like a 2 to 3 year issue, and it's important not to get too wrapped up in it. In 5 years, this is a fixed problem. I think in 2 years, it's a fixed problem. But I do think that, yes, it will soon become the case that if you're in legal practice and you're not using AI, you're just going to lose, right? Not to mention that your clients will just stop paying you. Because if I were an in-house client, or if I was just a client, and I get a billable hour, right, the first question I'm asking is, how do you use AI? And if I don't get a really good answer, right, like a really good answer, right, of how this firm or how you use AI every moment of every day to save time, I'm paying you 40 cents on the dollar. And so, yes, I do think that the lawyer with AI will soon defeat the lawyer without AI, and that means, but like the lawyer with Microsoft Word defeats the lawyer who uses a quill pen. This happens from time to time.
So I was wondering, thank you for talking. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about a bit of a link that I may be seeing between the second and the fifth, perfect enforcement and the unitary executive kind of being able to control all the decisions. Wouldn't you not be able to use that AI saying this is what the president would do to inform those prosecutorial decisions, which would then just exacerbate the bias we already see in prosecution, maybe on a bigger level?
Say more.
So the way I see it is like if you have a case, the prosecution has the choice to take a case, and that was a decision before that wouldn't involve any presidential decision making.
Yes.
Usually.
Yes.
But if you have this AI that can inform
Usually is doing a lot of work in that in your sentence right now.
Usually.
Yeah, usually.
But if you can have this AI that informs those decisions, would that bias, political, racial, whatever, just continue based on whatever this presidential AI is saying? Because it'll probably be biased one way or the other.
Yes. So a lot depends on what you mean by biased, right? Bias is a very tricky word because it can mean a million different things. Yes, you can absolutely have biased AI systems, and we've seen lots and lots of examples, right? Facial recognition systems that have very different error rates based on skin color. Generative image models that when you ask for an image of a doctor, it's always a white guy, and so on and so forth. That's a problem. That's a relatively fixable problem, actually. We kind of know how to fix it, and the models are so much better than they used to be. So again, without downplaying this problem, I think let's kind of think 2-3 years ahead, right? Because that's more interesting. I think you could have a world, and this is again why, and I think when I write this as a law review article, like that's the next step of this paper, of this lecture, I'm really going to spend more time on this. I am not an AI skeptic. Like I want more AI in the government. I'm actually, I think within the legal profession, about as pro-AI as it gets. So this lecture is a little bit kind of off trend for me, but it's been fun to put on my depressive hat for a few weeks. I think you could have AI prosecutorial systems that are extremely unbiased, right? You have to program them correctly. But the nice thing is, and there's a great phrase in kind of AI discourse, the AI you're using today is the worst the AI will ever be. AIs don't backslide, they only get better, right? And once you have a good AI, that's just the AI that you build on for the next step and the next step. So we can just, again, incrementally improve the AI systems to make them less biased. What I think you're referring to is actually different. It's not bias. It's presidential control over prosecutorial decisions. This is another example of a theme that has been running through this talk, which is the Constitution, none of what I'm talking about violates the Constitution. In some sense, it just amplifies what the Constitution already allows. Under our constitutional system, and this is, I guess, part of the unitary executive theory, but it's actually probably the part that even most quote-unquote liberals would probably have to agree with, it's very hard to imagine a system in which you have a truly independent Justice Department. in the sense of a legally independent Justice Department, right? I mean, you could, right? But if the unitary executive applies to anyone, it probably applies to the Attorney General, because the president is the law enforcement officer in chief of the United States. And so there actually is no good defense against presidential involvement in prosecutorial decisions, except 50 years of post-Watergate norms pushing back on that. Now, that doesn't mean that just that you can't do anything about that, right? But you have to do that on the back end as a defendant, right? So for example, right now, former FBI Director Jim Comey is arguing that the indictment against him is vindictive, right? False, but in addition to like substantively problematic, procedurally problematic in that he's being picked on by an individual, right? But arguing that a prosecution is vindictive is very different than arguing that a prosecution was commanded by the president, right? That is not a defense. Right? The president is simply allowed under our constitutional system, and I don't see this changing, right? Frankly, even if you had 9 Sonia Sotomayors on the Supreme Court, I have trouble seeing that change. So all of this to say is, yes, it's bad.
Other questions? Sure. Yeah. Oh, great.
It seems to me like the problem that you are addressing is the problem with all laws. And I attended the University of Toledo for a while. However, everybody does not work for the federal government, and the government does not have control over every person. If you start out with a free people, and the Constitution is to guarantee our rights of being free instead of being obedient, you don't have half these problems. The real problem becomes who is accountable for an error that an AI system generates and damages occur. Who is liable? If you solve that problem, the rest goes away. Anybody else? Any other question?
Yeah, sure, appreciate it.
First of all, thank you so much. That was a fascinating talk. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
But I'm more skeptical of AI than you are. And so I heard on the radio this morning that Meta just fired 600 people in their AI office.
Mm-hmm.
And as you may, I'm sure you know, I know you know, there are a number of economists that are warning about an AI bubble bust.
I think that kid is skeptical too.
And so I just wondered, I don't know if it's really a question, but maybe you could.
Sure.
Question mark.
Yeah. Let me riff on it. Again, I think it's really important to not get too. I think it's really important to not worry so much about the next 6, 12, 18 months and really think about 5, 6, 7 years ahead. I totally agree with you that the current circular financing model, where NVIDIA invests $100 billion in OpenAI so that OpenAI can buy $100 billion of NVIDIA chips and then everyone gets to put $100 billion on their balance sheets, that's not great, right? And so it would not at all surprise me, right? It would not at all surprise me, and my extremely conservative investment portfolio reflects this, right? I'm an AI guy. I do not pick stocks in AI companies, right? Like, that's not my thing. That we're gonna have a 20, 30, 40% correction in the next few years. A bunch of people are going to lose their jobs. It's going to be real ugly. And because actually the entire US economy right now is building data centers, quite literally, we're going to go into a very bad recession. Extremely plausible to me. I think that's all irrelevant. I think that it's, if we have a crash, it might be like the dot-com crash, but that didn't do much to stop the internet. It might be like the railroad crashes of the late 19th century, but we got a lot of railroads in the process. So I think absolutely you could have a lot of froth, you could have a lot of kind of bubble-ish activity, but the capabilities right now are profound. The capabilities that are kind of baked in, if you think about the next 18 months of already committed funds, the data centers that are going to be built even if there's a crash, and then the compute that's going to be driven to them, and therefore the GPT 6 or 7 that we'll get in the next 2 or 3 years, that's all baked in. And then, of course, the government doesn't, it's not that it's immune to economic conditions, but the fact that NVIDIA is going to lose a lot of money is irrelevant to the government if Donald Trump or President AOC, right? I mean, none of this is really about the current administration that much. Decides, hey, this stuff is kind of nifty, right? All the stuff that Rosenstein guy is tearing his hair about, I want me some of that. And then goes and builds a couple of servers in the White House basement and loads whatever latest open source model there is. But yes, please don't put your entire retirement savings in NVIDIA at the moment.
Hi. So I know you were not giving a full-throated defense of the Unitary Executive by any means, but let's assume for this question that we are believers in the Unitary Executive. Okay. I want to push back on the idea that it would be consistent with Unitary Executive thinking to be able to load information from the president into a generative program and then ask it questions and get results. And in fact, I would think that if one was committed to the Unitary Executive, one of the things that you are getting with that theory is the idea that we care deeply about the person of the president who we elected, that democratic accountability requires that this person, with all of their gut feelings and their quirks and their strong beliefs, are things that we are voting for, and that's what requires the Unitary Executive is that the things that are peculiar to them. So I guess maybe you could say more about this. Maybe this is a technological question, or maybe it's really a metaphysical question. Is it really the case that even if you were able to get what the data would show you that a person might say, is that really the same thing from a metaphysical or from a technical perspective as getting that person's take on it, including all the things that make a person a person?
Yeah, great. And this is what I think a Unitary Executive would say in defense of their theory. And so I got to figure out how to respond to it. I guess I'd say 3 things. The first is that if I can get a Unitary Executive person to say, oh, no, you can't use AI in this way, that's a victory, right? That's great. Like, I would like that on record, certificate suitable for framing, right, that I can wave around. That's good. Fine, that's good. The second thing I would say is, I think partially it's a technological question. You said, reason we vote for this guy, not that guy, is because, well, this guy has these quirks and this gut and this. Fair. I agree with you. You can train an AI on quirks and gut, right? None of this is magic. None of this is supernatural, right? These are all just patterns of thinking and behavior, right? And with enough training data, we can replicate this to whatever level of precision that we want, right? Just in the way that Netflix has gotten and Spotify have gotten really, really, really good at replicating my quirks and gut feelings about what I want to watch next. Like, that's the whole premise, right? And in fact, the advance of machine learning, deep networks, all that sort of stuff, is that it doesn't have to encode explicit kind of if-then preferences. The whole thing that it does is tries to replicate, and in fact can replicate, the inchoate gut feelings. And then the third thing I would say is, and I want to think about this a lot more. We should talk about it more. It depends on what you think the Unitary Executive means, because I think there's some slippage sometimes between whether it's about the person of the president or the White House, which are often used interchangeably, but operationally have very different implications, right? My sense, and you can see that a little bit from how some of the lawsuits against Elon Musk as administrator of Doge, was he, wasn't he, he was never Senate confirmed, all this sort of stuff. A lot of the responses from the administration, and I think there were some judges on the right who were sympathetic to this, were saying, no, he's just the advisor. He's just an advisor to the president, right? Stephen Miller is just an advisor to the president. Russ Vought is just an advisor to the president, right? They are not exercising authority because at any moment the president can come in and say, nope, I don't like what you're doing. I don't think that violates Unitary Executive theory. And I think if you were careful about building the White House AI decision system, right, which does all of this, but then has that feedback loop where the president goes in and he periodically samples, right? A lot of what his job becomes is not so different than what his job already is, which is sampling from his subordinates all the stuff that they did and saying, yes, I like that, no, I don't like that, yes, I like that, no, I don't like that, right? Except that one of his subordinates is now, the machine god.
That brings us to time, I think. So let's have a round of applause. Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you for having me.